How often do you listen to the views of people with whom you completely disagree? It can be uncomfortable or even unpleasant, but it's probably necessary for a thriving democratic society. That's where a new theatrical offering steps up with something that's both engaging and entertaining. The production, which is currently running at the Crow's Theatre in Toronto, is called The Assembly, and it's an example of what's called documentary verbatim theatre. Joining us now for more, Annabelle Sutar and Alex Ivanovich. They are the co-founders of Portrayal Productions, theater company, and co-writers of The Assembly. Alex is also one of the actors in the show. And Tanya Jacobs is here. She's also one of the actors in the play. And it's great to have the three of you here. Full disclosure off the top, I've seen the production. As you know, it was terrific. One of the reasons why we wanted you here, because it raises so many important themes to talk about. And just to sort of set the table for the discussion to come, let's play a little clip from your trailer. Sheldon, go.
I don't hold strong political views. I'm an immigrant in Canada, and I've benefited from the system here. I believe in equality for people. I believe in action.
Politically, I identify as an anarchist. I very strongly work towards decolonization. Liberty and collective rights are very important.
I'm a conservative. I like morals. I like values. I like living by the law. So when I feel that there's people coming to this country that don't embrace that, I have a problem with that.
James is a conservative who is open to people's ideas and having conversation, and freedom of speech is the biggest thing that he believes in.
Okay, let's understand, first of all, Annabelle, documentary theater. What is that?
Well, it's like documentary film. It's all the events, issues, people that you see up on the stage, played by professional actors, all exist in real life.
Okay, but that's different then. Documentary film is the real people playing themselves. You've got actors playing real people.
We're filtering all of this stuff through the artists, through the stage artists. So first the writer, who does the work to put the script together, to record the things from real life and then edit it into a script. Then a director and designers and actors come along and they contribute to that interpretation of the reality. So really what you see on the stage is not reality. It's a construction of reality. It's a reflection on reality. And it sort of allows us to ask the question, well, isn't all reality kind of a construction?
But the script that you say in the play is real. It's based on real conversations that real people have happened, right?
That's right. It's word for word what people have said. And the only thing that happens in our hands is we choose from far too many words and present sort of the best ones that allow us to get to know the characters, that put forward the ideas that we think an audience needs access to incite them to engage with the subject themselves.
Where did the spark for this show come from in the first place?
April 2016, I was watching the primaries in the US. American politics. And I was, to be honest, confounded by the momentum of Trump's campaign. This was before he was even nominated as the Republican candidate. And I felt that the media generally was dismissing him as a candidate and dismissing his supporters as kind of like rednecks and, you know, uneducated, rural inhabitants, et cetera. And I just wanted to get underneath that because there's no way like that he was having success. He was responding to something in people. And so I asked Alex and Brett if they would be interested in going down to the States to interview people.
Who's Brett?
Brett Watson is the other co-writer. We're three co-writers, and he's an actor in the play. Somebody who I've worked with before. Alex and I are co-founders of Portrayal, the production company that has put on The Assembly.
Were you allowed to say this? I was going to say, you're more than co-founders.
We're married.
Yes, you're husband and wife as well.
And so I said, guys, what do you think? Why don't we go down and just ask some questions? Let's find some Trump supporters and see what they say about why they're supporting this candidate.
Enter the femme fatale over on the right-hand side of the table here. You play Valerie.
I do.
We saw Valerie in that clip just a little while ago.
Yeah.
She likes things the way she likes them. What do you, when you try to interpret a character like that, what are you going for?
Well, you know, she's a very charismatic person, and that's part of what's troubling about her. She has extreme views, and appears to be unafraid of what people think of her. And It's, first of all, it's compelling and fascinating to play a person like that, because most of us are concerned in one way or another about how we come across, and I think probably deep down she is. But Valerie has a tremendous freedom in the way that she expresses herself about what she thinks, and she's direct. And we live in a not always direct culture, and so she's charismatic for that reason, but she's a problematic person because her project is hateful.
Well, you say it's hateful. She would just say, and in fact, you said she's mainstream. Excuse me, you said she's extreme. She would say she's mainstream. She would say you folks are a bunch of crazy lefties, and thus the bridge is blown up, and it's very difficult for both sides to communicate. She has a line in the play, "Truth is the new hate speech." Boy, that's a memorable line. What do you think of that line?
I think it's a shocking thing to say. But I think that Valerie gets a great deal of energy, and people who are exposed to her get a great deal of energy from the fact that she speaks in an unequivocal way. And, you know, I was remembering this in some conversations that I've had with some folks who've seen the show, that the last time that I played a character that had that much freedom of expression, to be that direct, I played a man. And it's uncommon in our culture, but it's particularly uncommon for women to speak that blankly, that directly. And there's something thrilling about it. But I have to say, at the same time, you know, I think we're in an infantile way almost, we're craving unequivocal communication from people because life is complicated, and we're burdened by complication. We're nervous about complication.
Yeah, she's had it with political correctness and all that
she's
business.
just blasting right through it and saying what she thinks. So it's a jolt for us to receive that from her. It's stimulating, but in some kind of secret way, it's also a relief to say, actually, it's either truth or untruth, and it's not more complex than that.
You don't share any of her views, right? Or pretty much none of her views?
None.
None, okay. I was going to give you a little benefit of the doubt, but okay,
No.
None. What's it like playing with somebody who, deep in your gut, you fundamentally disagree with on everything?
Well, first of all, she has a great sense of humor. She's funny. So that makes an aspect of her a little bit attractive, and that's maybe a dangerous thing to admit, but it's a human trait to see the humor in things and to want to be amusing. But I do think that Valerie is one of those people who perhaps didn't have enough of a sphere of influence in her life as a working woman. And now that she is of a certain age and is retired from the profession, which, you know, perhaps wasn't, you know, completely gratifying to her, she has now found a way to have a tremendous impact on people. And I think probably that's where her impulses come from. So as an actor, I don't think about her, the tension around her hateful feelings as much as her desire to make an impact on other people and to change them.
Now, it's interesting. You described those feelings that she has as hateful, and I'm going to go to the other side of the equation, because we saw in the background clip off the top this young man, anarchist, sanctimonious, pain in the neck. And he's diametrically opposed to everything that your character believes in. But do the two, Alex, you take this on first. Do the two of them, are they at such opposite extremes of the spectrum that somehow they actually meet?
Yeah, actually, we do have a moment in the play where James, the young conservative, draws a correlation between their extreme positions going so far that they actually overlap a little bit. I think, you know, when you do position people that have outspoken positions like these two people, for the same reasons that that Valerie can be compelling, Shane also is compelling for some people in that he drives an agenda that some people identify with. I know that, you know, you want to say a pain in the ass, but he's also one of the guards of the "thou shalt not pass" with this idea. And I think that's important to look at the content, not necessarily always at their success at delivering the message. You know, Valerie is successful and some people have trouble with the content. Shane has some ideas that are important to safeguard good conversation and respect between people, but occasionally his choice of expression allows him to be dismissed prematurely or ahead of his ideas.
Conviction. Like that's the thing that they have in common. They both have deep conviction, and so when they come up against each other, of course it's hard for them to listen because the other appears to be a real threat to their conviction. And so I think what we like, you know, as theater artists is just to explore the mechanics of that encounter. How does each of them, you know, stand their ground? And when do they become extreme? What is the thing that triggers more extreme and therefore alienating language?
I was just going to jump in with the fact that someone takes a position, you can now have a conversation. So we put 2 positions, in fact 4 positions on the table and 2 sort of moderators, and we're hoping that all these sort of expressed positions incite a reaction and create a voice in each of the audience members. That's the goal.
Now, you put the 4 real people in a room together, right? Once upon a time?
Yeah.
Yes, in December 2017.
And you just let them have at each other.
Well, I mean, we didn't let them have at each other. I mean, it wasn't a free-for-all. Brett and Alex were there. There's even
a moderated conversation.
It was moderated, but certainly
But it got heavy.
We wanted to give them, and I wasn't there. It's Brett and Alex who moderated it, and then the 3 of us edited the text together. But I think that they wanted to leave some room for the encounter to happen and only step in when they felt that either somebody had, you know, been disrespectful in their language, which happens at a certain point, or if they felt that, you know, some ideas were not coming to the table that they wanted to prompt out of some of the more introverted participants at the table.
Would you say, Alex, it was a, however you are defining this word, successful night?
I would say it was a perfect night. I would say that, you know, you sit 4 people together, everyone at the table expressed their position. In that regard, it was successful. It was also successful in the fact that we got to see how people had trouble receiving each other, which is exactly where we're at, which is exactly your exploded bridge behind us. I mean, this middle ground is called weak and scared or unassumed or privileged, and you know, that word is a dangerous word. I don't want to get lost in a quagmire of privilege. I acknowledge full privilege for my existence, but it's discounting sometimes the meeting place, the current dialogue, and I value the meeting place. We created a theatrical offering where, in fact, we told the story of people trying to speak, not succeeding entirely at reaching one another, and then offer the audience an opportunity to take that proposition one step further.
Hold off on that. We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. But clearly, the 4 of them had no difficulty expressing their points of view. What they seemed to be having difficulty doing from time to time was listening to anybody else's point of view, which is a lost art in this world today, apparently, and finding any shred of common ground.
For sure.
Is that a fair
Yeah, absolutely, and that's
summation?
actually in the play. We have cameras on the table picking up and providing a live feed of each of the actors' faces as they're participating in the discussion. And so what we're signaling to the audience there is, yes, we want you to listen to what people are saying, but we also want you to watch how people listen. And the actors, who are all, you know, so talented at just showing with a slight, you know, twitch in their face what's going on deep inside of them. There's a real narrative being told on the screens too, and about how we listen and then how we respond to people when we are threatened by what they're saying.
I want to ask you about Valerie, because she was there, I presume, opening night to watch the show. So she saw you playing her. Did she talk to you after the show? And?
She loved me.
She did, eh? Because?
I'm going to say, you know, off the top of my head, it's because it's a human portrayal. because I don't really sit in judgment of her. I commit myself to the actions that she commits herself to, and I try to understand what's motivating her to
you nailed her character.
Behave. Well, she's nailable. She's an extroverted woman with a great deal of confidence, and she has a flavor that I could capture. I think a lot of good actresses could capture her, but I think she finds me sympathetic, and the way that I am approaching her. But there's something alchemical and mysterious about portraying a real person, because it's not the first time that I've been in a portrayal documentary play, and I've met the person that I'm portraying, and people often feel honored and flattered, even if it's a critical portrait, which, this is also, it is a critical portrait. We reveal this woman's project, and it's a dangerous one.
Well, would you say she's alt-right?
I would.
Like white supremacist, the whole 9 yards?
I don't know. I don't know about the whole 9 yards. I don't know if she's a white supremacist. But she wants to have an influence. She wants very badly to have an influence. Yeah, maybe she's not alt-right. I don't know. I actually don't know.
But she's clearly a Trump-supporting, small c conservative over there on the right wing of the spectrum.
And she claims that she doesn't have any belief in the political system. That she's actually, she's outside of it. She's outside of the structure.
She has views on immigration too.
Yeah, she does.
Especially the recent, immigration of Muslims. So, that's where it gets quite difficult. Her point of view.
It is with some trepidation that I ask the next question, because in some respects I don't want to give away what is the great plot twist of the evening. But I got a feeling that if we don't talk about it, it's sort of defeating a bit of the purpose of having you here, because it's a great, unanticipated, unexpected moment where one of the actors simply says in the middle of the evening, okay, we're done, and we're going to leave. And we welcome members of the audience to come up and sit in our places at the table and continue the conversation. And then he walks off. And then there's this kind of 30 seconds of very awkward silence where everybody thinks, really? Are we really supposed to do this?
It's not a bluff.
and then we discover nobody is actually coming to rescue us, that you mean it. Okay, where'd that idea come from? Alex, go ahead.
Well, I think the idea came from looking at this polarized conversation and feeling that no matter what we did with this, and this concept came after we had traveled around the US, spoke to American people, realized we weren't going to crack the nut. It was not something that you could write in a formula for what humanity should do at this crossroads. So we realized that in order to complete the story, for the audience, for each individual audience, we needed to create a space of encounter.
Annabelle, what made you think anybody would dare take up the challenge and come forward in front of a room full of people and spill their guts about some of the most, quite intense issues of our time?
I think we were just curious to see what would happen. Dramaturgically, it felt like the correct thing to do after that first act is to say, okay, we had our assembly. Now, in order for us to continue to create, like Alex said, opportunities for encounter, we have to pass this space off and allow people to say, oh, this was a voice that was not represented, or this was an idea that resonated with me, but to basically allow them to assemble. So every time we do the show, we're practicing this, what I consider to be a dying art of assembly, and asking questions like, who should have a space at the table? What kind of language is acceptable within this assembly? Why is it important for us in an age of social media to have a physical space where we can meet each other face to face? Because I think face to face, we are different human beings. I think we speak differently to each other.
Is there ever a moment as the seconds go by and the audience sort of collectively and individually starts thinking to itself, do I dare go up there? Do I want to? Do you ever worry that no one's going to come forward? And basically, that's your show?
Absolutely. Every single night, I think there's that concern.
Has it ever happened?
I would say probably the longest that it's taken for someone to get up is about 30 seconds,
Yeah.
which feels kind of long in the theater.
It sure does.
But it's a beautiful image, I think, the empty table after what we've just heard. And I think it's that image of the empty table that, as well as the invitation of the actor, that compels people to fill that space. They feel that they need to now take responsibility for that space. And they need to start to innovate as well in the way that they practice public discourse, because they don't want to repeat what they just saw.
And particularly because what they've witnessed is, you know, despite what Alex has just said a few minutes ago, it's a failure. It's a failure to listen to each other and give each other. Valerie leaves before the evening is officially over. People talk over each other, and there isn't a lot of generosity. A character named Hope continually exercises optimism and generosity, but it's a failure, and that's also one of the reasons that it's funny, that the show is funny, is because it tanks in a kind of a spectacular fashion. But the assembly offers people an opportunity to address their, even their sense of grief about the fact that they've witnessed a failure, and to begin and maybe have a different kind of experience in the moment in front of one another.
I have one other tiny thing to add, and it's very basic. Like any good conversation, a person speaks, and then the other person gets to respond. So in a very basic way, the show is our part of the conversation, and it's only fair that this is what we say, now what do you say?
You presumably, and I think I saw it on the night of, members of the audience do come up and talk to you afterwards and say what they thought about the show or about the opportunity to speak. What do you hear from the people fed back to you about having been given that opportunity to participate? Okay,
last night is a perfect example because there's this sort of backstage area door. We made it 3.5 feet outside of that space. In fact, we were kind of clogging the door with people who wanted to talk to us about what had just happened. Behind me, there was a slightly more animated discussion because a person had gone to the table with a position that someone else wanted to continue to engage with. I don't know everything about that, Tanya, you were in that conversation, but in front of me were 3 people, one of whom had gone to the table, whose faces were so open and curious and stimulated. Their eyes were said to me that they just wanted to have something to hold on to because things had been kind of tossed up. Objects were floating in their minds, ideas, concepts, and this moment that we took, an actor and I and these 3 people, to just kind of center ourselves around what happened was really dynamic. It was very alive. And I think, you know, people are quite stressed in daily life. And, you know, people go to antidepressants and they go to, when in fact, I think there's nothing wrong with them. There's a lot wrong with how we interact with one another.
They need
those moments.
They need contact.
Where we talk truthfully about how they feel about what's going on, and that you don't instantly get punched in the stomach for uttering 2 wrong words, one next to each other.
Well, we had a woman who joined the long table discussion a few nights ago. As it happens, she was an American woman. We've actually had quite a few American visitors come to the show. It's interesting. Or maybe Toronto's full of them and we don't find out until they come to the table. Anyway, she's, in late middle age, comes from a large family, many siblings. So her siblings are divided, very divided. Some of them are extreme Republicans, and she said that there's been this division in their family for a very, very long time. But the problem now, she says, with her family is that they no longer argue. They
They've given up.
they simply avoid because they understand that that their disagreements are potentially so divisive that they're permanently damaging, or I don't know what their take is, but they're now a crippled family because they can't discuss their differences. People are forgetting how to argue. Oh my God.
Which they need to do in order to connect. It's like we need, instead of brushing those conflicts under the table, you know, we need to actually engage with them and get beyond them.
The night that I saw the performance, it got tense at the table, but it was fine, right? It was civil. It was civil. Have you had performances where members of the public come up and assume those seats, and it really turns into a you-know-what kind of show? I
haven't seen that yet.
Nothing has ever gone beyond what we show, as far as, you know, full-on conflict, and you shouldn't be allowed to say what you have to say.
So Canadians are civil at the end of the day.
A couple of people have walked out, though, I think, during the long table discussion, which is an interesting choice as well, because that would suggest that there's a very strong reaction to what's going on, and a decision to opt out of the discussion, which is a kind of, you know, judgment on the activity that's taking place.
This is a dangerous thing to ask, three people who make their living in the theater. But here we go. Whom do you think is more responsible for the state of decay in our common parlance nowadays? The left or the right? Go, Alex.
I would say that there is, I'm typically the bridge maker, so I'm not going to accuse one or the other, because I think that they each bring out the worst in the other. And the lack of desire to find common ground is the problem.
Go ahead, Annabelle.
It's a very interesting question, Steve, because, you know, some people have reacted to this saying, you know, on the left, yes, we can be intransigent, but we tend to be, and maybe this is a stereotype, more nuanced in our thinking, more curious about the other, and therefore more open to meeting the right, whereas the right tends to be like incredibly blunt in their refusal. Again, this is what some people on the left would say, and therefore we should be careful not to be too open at a time when it's really important to take sides. So I just say that because I would say in general, like if you look at media, and I, you know, total transparency, I do lean slightly left of center. I would say that media outlets that are generally labeled left seem to be more interested in conversation, in dialogue, in listening to the other side, whereas I feel like blasted sometimes by the right-wing media.
And of course, the Fox TV audience would disagree with what you just said.
Of course, of course. So, you know, but generally I agree with Alex that, first of all, it's not that constructive to point the finger at this point. I think that the best way forward is to kind of look at all sides and how they interact when they're together, and we just don't do that enough right now.
Tanya?
Well, I'm going to actually dodge the question just slightly and say that I think that the issue is that technology and social media has provided us with positions to do, you know, what I call drive-by criticism, where people have the freedom to express views and not watch them land on human beings, and that has encouraged people to stick to their guns and say explosive, damaging, divisive things because they're views that are not in relationship to who they're targeted at. It's an idea. It's like really like blasting somebody with a weapon, you know, when you're on the move. So and I think everybody is engaged in that, and we need to examine that.
I got a minute left here, which is a shame. Have you run into any criticism, Annabelle, of people saying, I don't like the way that you are normalizing alt-right beliefs, or I don't like the way that you are kind of humanizing hate? And if you have, what do you think about those observations?
Absolutely. It's a point that came up as we were creating the play. We did a workshop in Montreal last March, and the creative team was at times quite divided about what material was included in the play. And we were still writing at that point, so we were still making choices and really like filtering what the artists were bringing to us. But and now, you know, seeing it in front of a Toronto audience, certainly people are disturbed by some of the content. and wonder about, you know, have we done enough, for example, to deconstruct, quote unquote, Valerie's views, especially in a speech that she gives towards the end of the play. One of the lines that I love most in the play is James, our 21-year-old conservative, who says, you have to trust the intelligence of your audience. And, you know, we've been doing documentary theater for 20 years at Portrayal. It is our long-term goal to perform for an audience whose intelligence we trust, that we want to nourish, that we want to encourage, give them opportunities to speak up as well. And at the end of the day, that is the choice, that people can handle this because they're critical thinkers, they're grown-ups, and if they have something to add, they can come down to the table.
They sure can. For how many more days? How long is this production in?
We're up till Saturday in Toronto, November 3rd, and then in Montreal the week of November 11th.
Terrific. Thanks all of you for coming into TVO tonight, and we wish you the best of luck with your assembly, and we thank you for joining our assembly here at TVO.
Thank you so much, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.